Help support the show by joining the Patreon or becoming a YouTube member. Also, hit that like button and subscribe if you want more Browns-focused content. The Browns are not that far away from having the number one overall pick. The Browns also have a pretty bad situation in the quarterback room. So, number one overall pick, bad quarterback room. It seems like a match made in heaven for the Cleveland Browns to draft the first quarterback on the board. And the first quarterback on a lot of people's board is SHEDEUR Sanders. So a lot of people have been asking, hey, do the Browns have to take SHEDEUR? They get the number one overall pick, because it kind of feels like they have to. And should they take SHEDEUR, they have the number one overall pick. I think the answer to both those questions is no. No, they should not draft SHEDEUR Sanders. And no, they should not feel obligated to draft a quarterback simply because they have the number one overall pick. Now, before I get into why it is that I do not like SHEDEUR Sanders as the number one overall pick, or the number two overall pick, or the number three overall pick, or the number 5, 6, 7, 8, whatever, right? 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I don't like him in any of those top 10 areas. I will first explain the reasons it's not, right? Because I think a lot of people have stupid reasons for not liking SHEDEUR Sanders. And those stupid reasons get in the way of actual analysis about him. And I'm tired of the stupid reasons being the main things that people tout there, right? And here's what I mean by the stupid reasons. The worried about Deion Sanders stuff. Don't worry about Deion Sanders. Deion Sanders is going to do what Deion Sanders does, which is make it seem like he's going to wield all this power, make it seem like he's going to upend the system. But when the time comes for Deion to do that, or choose to just follow the system that's presented to him, Deion's going to play the game. And that's no disrespect to Deion Sanders, but he didn't get to the place that he got to, especially in business, by not being willing to play the game. This idea that he's not going to let certain teams draft his son is ridiculous. It's not going to happen. He does not have the leverage to do it. SHEDEUR Sanders himself is not a coveted enough prospect to do it for many reasons that I'll get into later in this video. It's a ridiculous idea. SHEDEUR Sanders and Deion Sanders will be happy to go to any team that drafts them. I promise you that. This is not a situation where SHEDEUR's going to turn his nose up at coming to Cleveland, or Deion's going to force his way out of Cleveland because it's not prime time enough. Deion Sanders might have been able to do that for himself back in the day, but he's Deion Sanders. This kid ain't Deion Sanders level prospect. He's not even a top 10 prospect in my mind. A lot of people have him outside the top 20. He ain't going to be able to do that, right? I know Mel Kiper has a number 3 overall on his big board, but that's Mel Kiper. This dude, that as a prospect, not solid enough. He doesn't have the Manning last name, which is so strong. People want to draft Arch Manning right now, despite he not playing like more than 3 games in a row. This is not Eli Manning. They don't have the leverage to do it. It also has nothing to do with any opinions I have of SHEDEUR Sanders as a human being, or even Deion Sanders as a human being. I actually think a lot of the stuff that comes with him being in that Sanders family is actually good stuff for him, right? I think Deion, while he is a bit much, is overall a decent influence on these young kids. Like, he seems to actually care about them at Colorado and does things that demonstrates that he does care about these kids. He seems to be a good father figure. He seems to be a good role model at Colorado, doing the things and surrounding these guys with a lot of guys with NFL experiences. I don't see his connection with the Sanders family as a negative, and I don't see anything about his personality a negative. I actually find his personality to be a positive. He seems like a coach's kid. He seems like somebody who's a really hard worker. He seems like first guy in, last guy out, film grinder type of guy. You can see it in how much he's developed, and I've watched him from his first year at Jackson to this year at Colorado. This dude is a hard worker. I don't have any issues about SHEDEUR Sanders, at least as an employee. I don't know what he's like in his personal life, so if there's any kind of controversy that drops between now and the draft, I don't know nothing about that. But as far as like his reputation as a worker, everything that I can deal with the context of his personality when it comes to football, I'd look at all those things as positives for SHEDEUR Sanders. So those aren't things that turn me off. I'm not sitting here telling you the Browns shouldn't draft SHEDEUR because I'm scared of Deion Sanders putting his thumb in everything. I don't care about Deion Sanders' influence in this particular situation because I just don't think SHEDEUR is a good enough player for him to have that much influence. And even if SHEDEUR was, it'd still be difficult for Deion to have that level of influence because he's not Manning. He's not a Manning family member, right? Like he's not entrenched into the fabric of the NFL like the Manning family is. He's a dude who was really good in the NFL and was a Hall of Famer, but not what the Manning family has become, which is basically the NFL's royal family. So no, this isn't a Manning family situation. Don't care about that. If you have personal issues with SHEDEUR Sanders or you don't like his personality or the fact that he wears a chain or an AP or has a podcast, I don't care about any of that. That I like that he does. I like what I've seen of his personality from what I've seen of him as far as the context of him being a football player and being employed to play football. Know nothing else about the young man, but I see no negatives there with his personality. These aren't the reasons you should not want to draft SHEDEUR Sanders. If these are the reasons you don't want to draft SHEDEUR Sanders, you should reevaluate why you don't like the dude because you might just be hating. Now, here's why I don't want to draft SHEDEUR Sanders. I think SHEDEUR Sanders as a prospect is a flawed prospect. And I think because so much of the conversation about SHEDEUR Sanders is, like I said earlier, pretty stupid, a lot of the legitimate issues with his game gets overlooked because instead of talking about football, we're talking about wristwatches and chains and Deion Sanders. And that has done a great disservice to SHEDEUR, and I think will ultimately do a great disservice to the evaluation of SHEDEUR Sanders. Right off the bat, if you're asking me for a draft comp of him, I think he's a worse version of what Teddy Bridgewater was as a prospect coming out in 2013. I see this whole draft, to be honest with you, it's pretty close to the 2014 draft, right? Where there were two quarterbacks, Johnny Manziel and Teddy Bridgewater, who everybody thought was going to go in the top 5. And then the draft came around and they didn't go in the top 5. They actually went in the late first round. And I think that was probably the spot for those guys to go. Now, unfortunately, the Browns took Johnny Manziel, and then Teddy Bridgewater went 32nd to the Minnesota Vikings. He ended up having a better career. There's a lot of parallels with Cam Ward and Johnny Manziel, although Cam Ward is much more disciplined than Johnny Manziel, and just a better football player overall than Johnny Manziel. But the Teddy Bridgewater one, that's the comp that I think is the most solid when it comes to SHEDEUR. He is basically Teddy Bridgewater, but I think he's a smaller athlete. I think Teddy Bridgewater is going to, 6'2", 1/8. They have SHEDEUR listed right now at 6'2", which means he's probably 6'1". So he's probably going to come in a little bit under 6'2", and they're probably going to come in around the same weight, which is like about 215. And I think that's where SHEDEUR will probably come in at. He looks about 215 when you look at him on film. So similar builds these guys have, even though I think Teddy has a little bit better of a build because he's slightly taller. If you look at their play style, they are very similar. Both of these guys are pocket passers who can get outside a little bit, like to throw downfield, get outside the pocket, make some plays out of structure, but mainly dudes who are going to win with their arms. And they have similar concerns coming out, right? Now, Teddy had more concerns about durability. Hand size was a big thing with Teddy Bridgewater, and his level of competition, because Teddy played in the Big East for 1 year and then also the American in the first year that it was established. So he wasn't a Power 5 school guy coming out of college. Now, SHEDEUR is technically a Power 5 guy, played in the Pac-12, played in the Big 12, but if you look at his performances versus the top tier teams that he's played, it is not impressive. And that is my first knock on SHEDEUR Sanders. Every time he's played a serious college football program, it has not looked good for him. Last year when he played Oregon, who's one of the best defenses in college football that year, he got destroyed. Then he played UCLA, who wasn't a dominant team, but they had a first-round pick on the defensive line. They were a pretty damn good defense in college football that year. He looked terrible versus them. You fast forward to this year. They played Nebraska. Nebraska's a mid-Big Ten school. He looked awful in that Nebraska game. And then you also go to the BYU game this year, right, where you played the best team in the Big 12. And he looked bad in that one too. And at some point, we got to start asking ourselves, why does every time this guy starts to get closer and closer to the top level of competition in college football, he looks worse? Now, Teddy Bridgewater, again, this is why I think Teddy's a better prospect in 2013 than SHEDEUR was. Teddy had that game versus Florida where he won in the Sugar Bowl, despite his concerns about strength of schedule. So you saw Teddy Bridgewater go up against a top 10 team in ball, have a great game against Florida. You have not seen that with SHEDEUR Sanders. That's something he never did in college football. It's a big question about SHEDEUR Sanders. And the reason it's a big question is the second knock I have on SHEDEUR Sanders. He's not a great athlete, but he plays a style that requires him to be a better athlete in the NFL than I think he is. I'm not sure what SHEDEUR Sanders is going to run at the 40. 40 times could be random, but I'm pretty sure his 10-yard split's not going to be very impressive. And his 40 is going to be, at best, 4.8, high 4.8s. I think he's probably going to land somewhere high 4.8, maybe 4.9, but it's not going to be a super impressive 40 time if he even runs the 40, which I do think he should try to run it if he thinks he can get less than a 4.8, because athleticism is a huge concern because he likes to roll out. He drifts a little bit in the pocket. Like, he's going to get on the edges of these protections, which means he's going to have to roll out of these things every once in a while. And at the NFL level, I just don't think he's athletic enough to get away with that, which is why when you look at the Nebraska tape, he gets ran down so much, right? Which is why the tape versus the better teams concerns me, because when he can't get away with rolling out, it seems to mess up everything that's supposed to be good about SHEDEUR Sanders. Now, look, I think SHEDEUR is a little bit more of an accurate passer than Teddy Bridgewater was at Louisville. I think he has a better command of the football. He probably has bigger hands than Teddy Bridgewater. I think that plays a huge role in it. But Teddy was a legitimate athlete coming out of Louisville, right? He was a 4.6 40 guy. I don't think SHEDEUR is a 4.6 40 guy. He was a high three-cone drill guy. Like, I think he was an 88th percentile of all guys who ran that drill at the quarterback position. SHEDEUR is not. And again, we're talking about a dude in Teddy Bridgewater whose pro career ended up being like, kind of he could be a starter, but mainly was a backup throughout his NFL career. And again, we're talking about drafting this guy in the top 5, in the top 10. So we talked about the lack of athleticism. We talked about the concerning play versus better competition and why the lack of athleticism kind of folds into that, right? Here's the third thing and a knockout blow for me. The sacks. He takes far too many sacks. And I know people are going to yell at me. Colorado's offensive line was bad. Well, fun fact, I'm comparing him to Teddy Bridgewater, right? Teddy Bridgewater, according to Pro Football Focus, had an offensive line who had a pass blocking grade of 56 his last year at Louisville. SHEDEUR Sanders at Colorado this year had a pass blocking grade for his offensive line of about 73.9. Teddy Bridgewater took 25 sacks in his last year at Louisville. SHEDEUR Sanders took 41. SHEDEUR Sanders' pressure to sack rate, 21.6. Teddy Bridgewater's pressure to sack rate, sitting at a cool 15. SHEDEUR Sanders has what I think the highest responsibility of his own pressures of all quarterbacks in the NCAA right now. He's creating his own problems. The reason you think Colorado's offensive line is bad is because SHEDEUR Sanders does things that makes that offensive line worse. He blows his def in the pocket. He drifts left and right constantly. He holds the ball far too long. You want to hear some crazy numbers about time to throw? Just on average, right? Time to throw for SHEDEUR Sanders is 3 seconds. Teddy Bridgewater, it was 2.88 seconds. If you want to look at some more specific numbers when it comes to time to throw, we'll look at passing depth, right? Because that's a little bit more, specific. When it comes to deep 20-plus yard throws, SHEDEUR Sanders has an average time to throw of 3.4 seconds. Teddy Bridgewater has an average time to throw on those same passes, 3.09. My bad, not 3.9, 3.09. So a significant difference there. Medium, so intermediate passing, 10 to 19 yards. SHEDEUR Sanders, 3.31 seconds. It's not an acceptable number. Whereas Teddy Bridgewater, 2.88. So one guy is hitting guys in rhythm. The other guy is holding the ball and waiting for second windows to get the ball downfield. Now, to credit SHEDEUR, when he does hold the ball, he throws a pretty nice ball. But is he going to get the opportunity to throw that ball in the NFL? And is he going to be as accurate when he's rushed in the NFL to get rid of that ball a whole quarter of a second early? Sometimes way more than that, half a second early, how much he holds the ball. I don't know. You couple that with the lack of athleticism, and then you pair that up with the fact that he has not played well versus the better college football teams that he's played, or at least the better college football defenses that he played. And then you have somebody, in my opinion, who is very unappealing to draft as a top 10 prospect. In my opinion, SHEDEUR Sanders is a much more palatable conversation as a prospect in the second round. Right? If you want to trade back in the first to get that fifth-year option, go ahead and do it. But I have major concerns. I get that the accuracy is there. I get that he can layer balls like no other quarterback in this draft class. And I think what SHEDEUR Sanders is, and why a lot of people are super excited about SHEDEUR, is that he is the closest thing that looks like a top-tier quarterback prospect. Because when you watch him at Colorado at times, and he's playing against, UCF or Cincinnati, you think to yourself and you say, hey, that's what it looks like. But then you remember he's playing UCF and he's playing Cincinnati. And then you watch him versus Nebraska. You'll watch him versus Oregon. You'll watch him versus UCLA. You'll watch him versus BYU. And you start to wonder why it don't look like that anymore. He resembles what you would want a quarterback prospect to look like. But I don't think he is, how do I put this? I don't think he possesses the athletic ability to be able to look like that against better athletes. I don't know if playing NFL athletes, it's kind of like when we watch DTR. And I'm not saying he's going to be as bad as DTR. That's not what I'm saying at all. But a similar thing happens when you watch DTR. Because when DTR is playing in the preseason, we're like, oh, he looks pretty good. And then he comes in there in the late part of a game in garbage time and there's no rush and he looks pretty good. But then when you start DTR and he goes up against a real NFL pass rush, he looks like the worst quarterback you've ever seen. The reason that is because DTR probably can process the game and play it at a certain speed. But once you dial that speed up to NFL level, it looks completely different. My concern with SHEDEUR is there's a little bit of that in his college game where it starts to look different when he can't be comfortable scrambling around and double turning and spinning around and doing all this stuff that he is definitely not athletic enough to do in the NFL. It starts to look different when he can't get away with drifting left and right. Now, there are times where he stands tall in that pocket and he makes some damn good throws. And that's why I think he is a pretty solid second-round prospect. But I'm not going to lie to you. The fact that he has not looked good when he's played better competition almost scares me off of him entirely. I don't think there's anywhere you would draft SHEDEUR where I would feel extremely comfortable about it. I would be in a wait and see mode until he plays NFL games to know if he's good or not. And there's a chance that SHEDEUR Sanders can be good, but this idea that like all of his flaws were because of Colorado, I don't think that's the case. I think honestly, Colorado did a great deal to mask up a lot of his flaws. If you're asking me, like he had a system in Colorado that was built by his father with him in mind. Think about that. Like everything Pat Shurmur did was under the employment of his father. And everything his father has done in his coaching career has been to serve SHEDEUR as a player. Right? He started coaching high school when SHEDEUR was in high school. He started coaching college when SHEDEUR was ready to go to college. Once he felt like SHEDEUR was ready to play in Power 5, he got a Power 5 job, right? Like everything in Deion's career has been about servicing his son. And there's something selfless in that on Deion Sanders' part that I do think is respectable. But acting like the Colorado situation was not a situation that overall made him look better is kind of silly, because that situation was built for him. Like that is Deion Sanders saying this is the perfect situation for my kid. And still, when you played those better schools, you had those issues. What does SHEDEUR Sanders look like when he's not being coached under the watchful eye, or at least being supervised under the watchful eye of his dad, when he's running a system without him really in mind all like that? That's a serious question. Nobody's asked it. The level of competition question I brought up here, not enough people have asked that. People just kind of threw that one out, right? The whole pressure to sack stuff, people kind of brushed that one aside. It's a serious question. This dude takes way too many sacks. He holds the ball way too long. It's not because his offensive line stinks. His offensive line is not great, but it's not bad. Hell, in that game versus BYU, Colorado's defense got 3 turnovers. Colorado, for the most part of that game until garbage time, put up 7 points. That's an offense with 2 top 5 picks, apparently. 7 points. Where would that ever be acceptable? In a landscape where we're going to throw out somebody like Curtis Wark, and rightfully so, because he looked terrible versus Notre Dame, he looked bad versus Michigan, and he looked god-awful versus Ohio State, right? Everything else Curtis Wark did got thrown out. And again, I don't disagree with this, but everything he did got thrown out because those 3 games demonstrated that when the game speeds up for him, all that stuff that you like, it goes away. And even Curtis Wark put belt to ass against Nebraska. SHEDEUR got beat down by Nebraska and looked bad while doing it. It wasn't just like, oh, the defense got beat. SHEDEUR didn't look good in that game. How are we not asking that same question? How will we not have those same concerns? And keep in mind, Curtis Wark has those concerns. He played in the Big Ten this year, the best conference in college football. The Big 12 was far from the best conference in college football. No concerns for SHEDEUR there. That's weird to me. I don't know why that's the case. These giant questions I have about SHEDEUR are why I don't feel comfortable drafting him in the first round. And I wonder if NFL GMs will have these same questions, because a lot of people are assuming that a lot of quarterbacks are going to be taken off the board here in the first round. I don't know if that's the case. I think that this is going to be like 2014, where these quarterbacks might be available in the back end of the first. And would I recommend trading up to get one of these guys? I wouldn't feel great about it. I'm going to be honest with you. I wouldn't feel great about trading up to go get Cam Ward from the second round. I wouldn't feel great about doing that for SHEDEUR Sanders. I think there's a lot of people who would. I'm not one. I got too many questions about the guy. One of the things I think a lot of people have to think about with SHEDEUR Sanders is he's been a more protected prospect than most. Most prospects don't get to go to schools in programs that were crafted by their fathers. And I'm not saying that SHEDEUR Sanders is a Nepo baby and that he hasn't earned any of the acclaim that he has on his own and that all of his success is a creation of his father. Far from what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that his father was able to do a great deal to protect him in his journey in college football. That was quite literally the design of Deion Sanders coaching college football, was to protect his son, right? And to put his son in a good spot. This is a more protected player or a more protected situation than most. So when you see these flaws, you really got to look at them And if these flaws were small, you got to look at them as if they're big. My thing is that these are not small flaws. These are big flaws that SHEDEUR has. And people are just ignoring them or not really taking the time to really think about these flaws. And where does that leave us with this guy? I have too many questions for SHEDEUR for the first round of this draft. Almost too many questions for the second round of this draft. The athletic stuff, it scares me because I can deal with somebody like Jalen Milroe, who's a great athlete, but not necessarily up there as a passer yet, because I know athletically he'll be able to play in the NFL. With SHEDEUR Sanders, like if he's not athletic enough to play in the NFL, then he offers you nothing. And that is something that I can't really, like, this team can't have another one of those at the quarterback position that they're committed to for the next 3 years. And that's what concerns me, right? Like, that's why I would be probably more willing to go Jalen Milroe in a second. Like, I think it'd be easier to talk me into that than it would for SHEDEUR, because I look at SHEDEUR and I see a slightly worse version of Teddy Bridgewater. And that is not worth a second round pick, in my opinion. When I look at Jalen Milroe, I go, hey, man, like he could just like run really well and that be worth it at the end of the day. Have too many concerns about SHEDEUR to even think about having him go number 1 overall. I hope this was able to be a productive conversation for those of us who are willing to have a productive conversation over SHEDEUR Sanders. I'm pretty sure that like 90% of the people in the comment section commented like the first 5 seconds of this video and just literally regurgitated all the dumb shit about SHEDEUR Sanders and the Deion Sanders family narratives that I just like dislike about this whole vibe going on with the coverage of the Sanders family specifically. But as a prospect, these are my concerns about him. These are the things I don't like about him. These are the things that concern me about him, and ultimately why I just can't get myself to even feel remotely comfortable suggesting that the Browns take him in the first round of this draft. That doesn't mean I think he's going to be a terrible player. That doesn't mean that I'm closing the book on the kid and he's trash and he'll never be anything. But it does mean that if we're talking about a top 5 pick, if he hits for somebody as a top 5 pick, God bless him. But I will never be mad at that because I can understand why somebody wouldn't want to do that. And it's not for the dumb reasons people cite. It's for these real specific football reasons that like there's tangible evidence about that kind of go under talked about because we're so focused on the dumb. That's my thoughts. Let me know your thoughts. Peace.